Thanks, Dr. Birkhaug, for that exceedingly kind introduction. It is more than I deserve. It's still weird to hear Dr. Birkhaug. It's still new, a couple of months now. My students at Hope either call me Doc or KB. You can call me what you want, just don't call me late for dinner. My presentation for you guys today is entitled Mercy Otis Warren, the Constitution in American Memory. Some of you might be familiar with Mercy Otis Warren. If you're not, that's fine. We're going to talk about her and who she is. But just generally, she's a woman who lived during the American founding period, and not only did she live through it, she had things to say about it, important things including about the Constitution. The motivating question for this research, can everyone see slides okay? Good, okay, is this. What is the purpose of the Constitution? And on its face, this seems like a simple question with relatively straightforward answers, but if we dig a little bit deeper, it's pretty evident that Americans don't have a consensus about the Constitution in a lot of ways, right? We're still having conversations about how this thing should be interpreted, what it means, what it's for. In general, when we look to the founders, we get one sort of understanding of what the Constitution is for. Of course, prior to the Constitution, the United States had the Articles of Confederation, sort of a loose understanding of how the states would come together as one. However, the Constitution as we know it instituted a supreme federal government, right? So instead of just having individual sovereign states come together in agreement and consensus, a new federal government was created that would reign supreme over the states in some ways. We know that this happens inside of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Additionally, we know that the Constitution defines our powers and structures of federal government. We understand through the Constitution what the legislature is going to look like, the executive, the judiciary, these sorts of things. We know that this is one of the purposes of the Constitution. Additionally, we know that this document transitions the United States from a confederacy, this group of individual sovereign states, to a federal state. So instead of having 13 individual sovereigns, we now have one sovereign federal government and then the state governments below that. So this is our understanding of the Constitution's purposes when we focus on what the founders do inside of Independence Hall in Philadelphia in 1787. I want to put forward a new thesis, given my reading of Mercy Otis Warren. And this thesis is tripartite. It proceeds in 3 parts. The first is this, that when we read Mercy Otis Warren, specifically her thoughts on the Constitution, and then more generally her thoughts on the origins of the American project broadly writ, we get a different perspective on what this thing might be for. More specifically, 2, Warren advocates for a constitutional order that will enshrine a certain understanding of American memory. So she's going beyond just establishing an institutional order, elements of government. She has this idea that something like memory is going to play into the Constitution. And due to this advocacy, we can see that Warren saw the Constitution as an essential element in forming American identity. Not just American politics and political institutions, but the character of a people, how they would be, the things they would value. I'm going to hope to prove this to you guys in about 4 parts. First, I want to give a little bit of background on Mercy Otis Warren, who she was, what was important about her, what sides of the debates of the Constitution she fell down on. As you can see, I've put it up there on the screen. She's an anti-federalist. Next, I want to talk specifically about her critique of the Constitution. She publishes in 1788 an essay called Observations on the New Constitution, which is seriously critical of it. It has some major, major issues with this thing as presented. And then I want to talk a little bit about this idea of memory that she brings up in her critique, what it means, and if we follow it through to its logical conclusions, what it might mean for how we understand ourselves as Americans and the purposes of our Constitution. I'll conclude with a little bit of an upshot, what this means for us today, and then I will be super glad to answer any questions that you guys might have. I'm excited to hear what you think of this. So let's get going and get her started here. Mercy Otis Warren. Who is she? So Mercy Otis Warren is born in 1728, which means by 1776, the first year of the American Revolution, she is fully mature. She is a mature woman in her 40s. Okay? She's born in 1728. She lives through the entirety of the lead up to the revolution and observes it as an adult. She's born into the Otis family, and her father, James Otis, was an important and well-to-do lawyer in Massachusetts. By and large, she's considered some of the royalty of the Revolution era. That only becomes more pertinent with the family that she marries into. Like most women of her day, it was not automatically assumed that she would have some kind of formal education or an education for purposes beyond being a domestic or a homemaker. However, when one of her brothers dropped out of a repeated tutoring engagement, her father, James Otis, let Mercy slot in. So leading up to her teenage years when her brothers went off to college, she received the same education that most boys did. It was by this that she came into contact with a lot of the important texts of this era, including texts regarding law, politics, and philosophy. She married James Warren in 1754. That made her a little bit of an older bride for her time. She was about 26. A lot of her biographers say that men didn't want to marry her in general because she was so much more educated than other women of her day. But at any rate, James Warren doesn't seem to care all that much. He marries her in 1754, and they immediately have 5 boys. She raises 5 children throughout this period in time. And the Warren family is another of the kind of Massachusetts royalty during the Revolution era. By way of her connection with James Warren, Mercy Otis Warren gets thrown in the way of the men commonly known today as the Sons of Liberty. So this included John Adams, the second president of the United States, his Spitfire cousin Sam Adams, as well as a variety of other relatively famous and prominent men who, by the 1770s, were eagerly anticipating the independence of the United States. It was through her contact with these men, specifically John Adams, that they recognized her talent as a writer, specifically as a poet. You guys may be familiar with this occurrence called the Boston Tea Party. The thing she publishes in 1774 is this propaganda poem about that occurrence, what had happened, and it's this sort of glorious retelling of the story of all of these sorts of things that happen. John Adams encourages her to do this. She writes throughout the Revolution and throughout the founding eras, and she becomes sort of a muse for the Antifederalists in particular, but also early American patriots. So as I said, she was affiliated with the Sons of Liberty. These are important to her. She was a Lockean. Those of you who are familiar with political theory will know John Locke. Her brother, Jemmy, when he went to Harvard for school, used to bring her back books, and her favorite book was by John Locke. By way of this, she was specifically concerned politically with individual liberties and freedoms. She cared a lot about the individual person and how to maintain insular individual rights. She was also, by way of these proclivities, skeptical of popular figureheads. So George Washington, by this point, was famous, almost universally beloved, but Mercy Otis Warren regards him with skepticism virtually until his death. And this is because she was afraid of what one might call Caesarism, the ability of those who are popular and powerful to seize more power than they are due. During the time in which she wrote up until her death in the early 1800s, She published a variety of things, but two that are most important, both generally and for the content of today's talk. The first is known, as I said, as Observations on the New Constitution. This was an essay she published in 1788, largely in response to the Federalist Papers. The other is a book-length project called The History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution. Oftentimes, Mercy Otis Warren is cited as a profoundly bad historian because she remembers a lot of details wrong, and she often embellishes. The argument partially that I want to make today is that this is because her preoccupation is not as much with history as it is with memory, which is something much more subjective than history is in terms of fact. So now that we've established who Mercy Otis Warren was, let's look specifically at her constitutional critique. So most of you will be familiar with the core debates of this constitutional convention period. Of course, we have the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists, by and large, are considered the party responsible for crafting and creating the Constitution. But you have anti-federalist opposition. The anti-federalists, by and large, are sort of a disparate group. They are not as united or as insular as the federalists are. So they object by way of letters that are published publicly. You may have read some of them. The important authors include the likes of Cato, Brutus, and Sentinel. Of course, these are all pen names, right? But they write against what is coming out in terms of the new Constitution. And the Federalist Papers, by and large, are the response. Of course, we know Hamilton, Madison, and Jay write these in defense of the Constitution and in hopes that the people of the states will read them and ratify it. The Anti-Federalists had a number of concerns regarding the Constitution. Most of them had to do with the diminishment of state and individual rights that they assumed would accompany the centralization of government. They were also concerned that the federal government, by way of centralizing and accumulating the power that was anticipated, would become in some ways tyrannical. And tyranny was, of course, the accusation lodged against the British government, that the British government had become tyrannical, and it was upon these grounds that the American colonies insisted upon their independence. It's into this conversation that Mercy Otis Warren's Observations on the New Constitution enters. And at first glance, when one reads it, it looks in part like a sort of typical anti-federalist argument. She's hitting all the main points. What about the diminishment of state rights? What about the diminishment of individual liberties? How can we prevent tyranny? But if we look a little bit closer at what she's doing, we can see something else going on that other anti-federalists aren't necessarily paying attention to. And the good news for any of those who may have read it or will read it in the future is that she gives it away in the very first line. This is how she begins the Observations on the New Constitution. Mankind may amuse themselves with theoretic systems of liberty and trace its social and moral effects on sciences, virtue, industry, and every improvement of which the human mind is capable. But we can only discern its true value by the practical and wretched effects of slavery. And the way Warren is using slavery here does encompass American chattel slavery, but used more specifically in context refers to the oppression of peoples by their governments. She says here that theorizing about liberty is not enough to ensure it. You have to have some kind of tangible connection to the practical experience of oppression. That's the only thing that can make you love liberty. Preserve it the way it should be preserved. She goes on and she lists a variety of nations, regimes, if you will, that have been these sorts of theoretical regimes that have focused too much on the idea of liberty and not enough on its practical experience. The ones she names are intentional: Greece, Rome, Italy, Great Britain. And she names these on purpose because throughout the course of human history, these have been the torchbearers of liberty. Within each of these regimes, you have had great thinkers who have identified human freedom as a necessity, as something important. And you have seen these individual regimes take on laws that reflect this, the need for liberty. But just as well, Warren tells us, we have seen these regimes fail to continue to carry this torch of liberty. Eventually, they decay, they erode. They care less about liberty than they should. And this can be due to a variety of reasons, faction being one. People stop agreeing on certain things. But also decadence. This plays a role, right? Greed, the desire for more than one needs or has, leads not only to oppression within countries, but the oppression of other countries on behalf of that greed. And Warren, in her History of the American Revolution, makes it clear that when these regimes fail, they fail in part because of forgetfulness. They forget. At one point, they own and hold the knowledge of liberty's importance, and they forget it. So in this way, Warren sees history as a cycle. It's something that repeats over and over. Regimes come to know the necessity and goodness of freedom, and they forget it. And they do it over and over again. And now here, we have the United States having freed itself from Great Britain, the new hoister of this torch of liberty. And what will happen? This is her concern. If the United States wants to break the cycle of history, according to Warren, it has to remember. It has to remember what it means not to be free. And she thinks that this will happen by way of preserving and maintaining what she calls the principles of the revolution. These are the things that we need to remember. These are the things that need to be enshrined in the Constitution. Warren uses this phrase, the principles of the revolution, over and over and over in her important writings. She's not always exact on what she means by this, but she gives us a couple of specific things. She says that the revolution was premised on the love of the public good, that there's an understanding of love for the common, profound reverence for the laws, which is interesting, right? Because by and large, the revolutionaries were considered lawbreakers. But no, Warren says that the revolution is premised on reverence for the laws. Additionally, she says contempt of riches is part of this. If we think about what sparked the revolution, taxation without representation might come to mind. An attempt by the British government to aggrandize itself on the backs of the American colonists. And then something that she calls a noble haughtiness of soul, a sort of pride of spirit, that one is unwilling to be oppressed, unwilling to cede one's liberty. When taken together, all of these principles amount to something. They arise from an acute knowledge of what Warren calls the practical and wretched effects of slavery, of oppression under a government. This is what results from that. These are the principles of the revolution, the thing that drives men to lay down their lives for liberty. And these are the things that Warren worries are not properly enshrined in the new Constitution. She lays out a variety of beefs, one could say, with the Constitution. And it boils down to things like this. We do not preserve these values in our people. So she offers some prescriptions for the Constitution, right? In order to preserve these principles, to preserve this memory of what it means not to be free and the love of freedom that comes with it, one, we should probably codify the liberty of the press. That would be nice. define and limit judiciary powers, separate the executive and judicial branches further than they had been previously, assure jury trials in civil cases, eliminate the standing army, fund state governments, assure term limits, and really assure them, because she's very worried about the Senate, she says 6-year terms. That's going to turn into lifetimes. Narrow the influence of federal representatives. Back then it was 30,000 people to each representative. She says that's simply too much. It's a lot more now. Eliminate the Electoral College. What is that? You're compressing people's freedom of choice down to 10 people or something like that? That is not freedom. And then, of course, she says you should probably add a Bill of Rights. Things that individuals and states can count on keeping for themselves. By and large, actually, Warren's observations on the new Constitution, if you trace it through to its conclusion, this is the piece that's responsible for ensuring the Bill of Rights. It's Warren, specifically, not the other anti-federalists. She gets basically none of this. We codify the liberty of the press, that's nice, we get a Bill of Rights, but all this other stuff, virtually unchanged even with the addition of the Bill of Rights. So Warren has this fear moving forward of what this Constitution is, what it's going to do. She is worried that the way the Constitution is written currently is going to actively inculcate the forgetfulness that erodes liberty over time. It is really easy to cede power to a federal government, especially when that government is premised on benevolent motives, right? Smart men who are pro-US, right? It's easy to give those powers away, in part because governing oneself and governing one's localities and states, the things that take our engagement, is extremely difficult. It is hard for us to be free. It takes work. But Warren knows and assures us that this is a privilege worth dying for. The principles of the revolution show us that. These are the things that people fought and died for. They were willing to do that because they knew what it meant not to be free. And as Warren looks at the Constitution and she sees it, she worries that it does not do a sufficient job of honoring the memory of what it means not to be free. It doesn't honor the memory of oppression. And it's only through the memory of oppression that we can keep freedom alive. So what does this memory idea mean? What does it mean for us to remember? And what does this have to do with the Constitution? As Warren looks at the Constitution, her concern is this: what type of people is this going to create? Her concern is less about the institutions. I mean, she's concerned about the institutions. She writes a whole laundry list of things that she's concerned with regarding the institutions. But at the heart, the very beginning of her observations is this: what kind of people is going to result from this Constitution? What are they going to value? What is this document going to teach them to care about? How are they going to unite together? What types of things are they going to unite around? And she has some ideas for what they should unite around. Because for Warren, to remember the principles of the revolution, to preserve these in time, is to create a free people. People who never forget what it means not to be free. If people remember consistently what it means not to be free, they will be hungry for and jealous of their own freedom. But even more than this, for Warren, this is forward-looking and progressive. A people concerned with and jealous of their own liberty will also be concerned with and jealous for the liberty of others. I mentioned earlier that Warren's mention of slavery also includes American chattel slavery. This is true. She is one of the first advocates among the founding generation for both abolition and improved treatment of Native Americans. To say nothing of women, she is one, right? To remember the principles of the revolution is to carry them forward into the future, not just keep them stuck in the past and present for oneself. Alternatively, a country that forgets the principles of the revolution is going to result in a country that forgets why freedom matters. It is going to be a country that experiences oppression both within its boundaries, with a government oppressing its people, and without. It will become an oppressor of other nations, just as Great Britain did, Greece, Rome, Italy, etc. And in this, if the United States were to fall prey to it, would result in the cycle of history simply repeating itself. The US becomes Great Britain, and the torch moves forward with someone else. So this leaves us with some questions with regards to our Constitution. In particular, what have we remembered, or what has our Constitution made us remember? Do we love freedom the way that Mercy Otis Warren would have wanted? About a generation and a half later, Alexis de Tocqueville, the French writer, visits the United States and he says, no, actually, Americans don't really value freedom, certainly not as much as they value other things. In fact, Americans would rather all sit at the bottom of the barrel together than have freedom and inequality. And then additionally, are Americans hungry for the freedom of others? And this is a question I'll leave open-ended. I think there are many ways you could potentially answer this. But in a country that inculcated the love of freedom that Warren describes, you would see visible evidence of a country that cares about the freedom of others. So we have this constitutional order that only does some of the things, only corrects a few of the things that Warren would have wanted corrected. And she had these deep fears about whether or not this constitutional order would enshrine memory in the way she desired. Does the lack of love of freedom among Americans, observed by Tocqueville, indicate a failure of our constitutional order? Have we failed to understand the purposes of the Constitution in this way? And the upshot of this is basically this. I'll come back to the question that started this research. What's the purpose of this Constitution? Well, according to Warren, it is not merely about constituting institutions. It is not just about describing how government is going to function. It is constitutive of a national identity and spirit. For better or for worse, there is something about the Constitution that makes us who we are. And she had an idea of the things she wanted to see in it. Some of them were included, others were not. Does this document, in your opinion, officially or in some clear way promulgate the principles of the revolution as Warren describes them? Maybe she was blowing things out of proportion. Maybe her fears were unwarranted. But if it doesn't, if the Constitution doesn't promulgate these ideas, should it? We always have the power of amendment, always have the power of change. Does this document protect us from forgetting the meaning of freedom, the importance of freedom? And if it doesn't, should it? And finally, what kind of guide is our Constitution for our nation's future? This is a question that's currently being asked and answered, particularly at the bench of the Supreme Court. What does our Constitution tell us not only about who we were and who we are, but who we may be in the future? And how does understanding the Constitution as constitutive of our national identity add to this conversation? I'm going to leave it there with some food for thought for you all, and I'm happy to take questions.